come to what I want to do, which is to talk about books and in a way a reading list for Policy Wallahs. I'll start with the slide जो मैंने पिछली बार दी थी कि my sense is, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but this is how I look at it. I think leaders tend to read books, not because हर book पढ़ने वाला leader होता है, but if you are, you should, because that's where ideas come from. And that's what I really want to talk about, कि ideas matter. कि असली नंबर जिंदगी में सिर्फ आइडिया का इन अ वे हम कई बार कहते हैं कि आइडिया ठीक है, एक्शन कौन करेगा, बट एक्शन आइडिया के बगैर आना उतनी ही एक डेंजरस चीज है जितना आइडिया के बगैर एक्शन आना, इनफैक्ट उससे भी ज्यादा. व्हेन यू हैव एक्शन विदाउट आइडियाज you lead to far more problems. So I want to put that ideas. Now, newspapers also are good. In some ways, followers read newspapers because they look for trends. That's not a bad thing. Because that's what information does. And this is the distinction I want to make. Now, of course, losers read nothing because उनको पहले सब कुछ पता होता है, तो उनको तो पढ़ने की कोई जरूरत नहीं है. वो ठीक है. लेकिन with that out, what I really want to do, let me throw some caveats before I start. They are important, but not important enough to put on a slide. First of all, what I'm going to present is not, this is important, it is not my list of favorite books. अगर मेरी list of favorite books होती तो यकीनन कुछ और होती. I'm sure it would have had some poetry books. I'm sure it would have had some history books. I'm very sure it would have had a lot of fiction. That's not what it is. What I want to put forth is books that inspire ideas, even when I don't like them. A number of these books you will see are contradictory in their ideas. But what makes them important, at least to me, to put on a reading list for my students or for you, is that they make you think. And that's the point. And in the third caveat I'll put, as you look at it, is okay, they are not even the best books by the people you will see, in my opinion. In many cases, you will see, I'll point out कि इस बंदे की ये दूसरी किताब बड़ी अच्छी है. So this is not कि जी मुझे बता दे मैंने कौन सी किताब पढ़नी. This is about ideas and how ideas ought to influence policy. So that is the background, and I've taken too much time on the background. So let me move forth to the substance here, and I will start the substance with three propositions. First, as I said, ideas matter. They may be the only thing that matter. And I think it is a very sad state of affairs, जहां हमने ideas को मजाक बना दिया. In a way, it is fine to say कि नहीं यार ये तो आप तो बस ideas की बात कर रहे हो. The other word that I think we've done a disservice to is theory. As if theory गाली. Theory जो है मेरे ख्याल में वजूद का सबसे pinnacle है. As if theory का मतलब somehow ये बन गया है कि things that don't matter or things that don't work. That is not what theory is. Theory is the only thing that matters. Without theory, action is not really relevant. It's happenstance. Now, that doesn't mean that without action, theory is complete, but without theory, action becomes meaningless. And we do this all the time. आप जब गाड़ी रोकते हैं अपनी लाल बत्ती पे अगर रोकते हैं तो इसलिए रोकते हैं कि आपकी एक थ्योरी है कि अगर मैंने नहीं रोकी तो दूसरी तरफ से कोई गाड़ी आएगी मुझे मार देगी. Right? There's a theory. And when you see that that is not true, meaning the other गाड़ी is not stopping, the theory is falsified, therefore your action changes. I'm giving a very simple example here, but what I'm really trying to think is at a place like PIDE, at a place in a university, ideas matter and theory matters. Theory matters not because we are devoid of action, but because action devoid of theory and ideas is devoid of impact. Right? That I'm taking time on that, but that is really, really very important. And the third is that it is a sad state if those who can read don't, because that means that then we have no advantage over those who cannot. जो नहीं पढ़ सकता वो तो इसलिए नहीं पढ़ता ना कि वो पढ़ नहीं सकता. आपकी क्या excuse है या मेरी क्या excuse है, right? That's the point. Okay, let me move on. So last time when I had come here, I had come with 10 books and authors and ideas that I had shared with you. Now I should say that in the advertisement it said this is part 2. It's really not part 2 because some of those books I am repeating again. The toughest part of preparing this presentation was figuring out who to take out. So if I've taken out someone, it's not because they are no longer good. it is simply because other ideas are more relevant at this point. And मैंने थोड़ी सी cheating किया. Last time I'd come with 10, and because it was so difficult to take people out, this time I'll show 12. But again, I point out, this is not my favorite books. These are not the most important books either. These are ideas that I think are relevant to anyone thinking about policy in Pakistan today. So the first person I would start with is someone I've been spending some time with, or at least online, in the last year, which is Thomas Piketty. And I assume that Thomas Piketty is someone that a number of people here know. His most famous work was this book called Capital. But the book I'm really pointing out, I'll just take one book from each person as the articulation of the idea, is his newer book, which is called Capital and Ideology. टॉमस पिकेटी की किताबों का एक फायदा ये है कि उससे आप अखरोट भी तोड़ सकते हैं, बड़ी मोटी मोटी होती हैं. They're extremely well researched. He is very, very quantitative. His footnote section is longer than most people's books, which means that he takes evidence very, very seriously. And he has a very large span of historical overview, nearly from the beginning of organized society. And in the first book, he looked at essentially US and European societies. And in the second one, which is again about 600, 500 pages long, he tries to answer one of the criticism by looking at other societies. I'll come to the idea in a minute. So he looks at US European nexus, but then he looks at China, he looks at Soviet, and then he looks at India. And essentially he's taking the word capital from Marx. And the reason the first book at least became such a major powerhouse of ideas and spewed, literally changed the face of many people's lives in terms of wo dissertation kis pe kar rahe hain, wo kaam kis pe kar rahe hain, you couldn't write about these things without mentioning him, whether you like him or not, is because in very simple terms, but with great precision of facts, he highlighted this sort of iron rule of economics, if you will, which was the simple idea. It took him 600 pages to give the simple idea, but the idea is a very powerful one, whether you like it or not. The idea is that in societies, the rate of growth of capital, of those who are investing, becomes higher than the rate of growth of the economy. क्योंकि आप अगर capital invest कर रहे हैं इसीलिए कर रहे हैं. And therefore, the accumulation of capital outpaces the growth of economy, and that necessarily increases the inequity. Right? That's why it's an iron law. In some ways, I don't like कि वो हम हर चीज में अपना कोई ढूंढ ले. लेकिन अगर किसी ने इब्न खुल्दून पढ़ा है तो उसका आइडिया ये तो नहीं था. But basically, his idea of cyclical society, की society ऊपर जाती है, फिर बादशाह के बच्चे खराब हो जाते हैं, बादशाह के बच्चे खराब हो जाते हैं, तो फिर वो गिर जाता है, फिर दूसरा बादशाह आता है, and so on and so forth. It's somewhat analogous, but not exactly. But the idea essentially जो इसका था कि inequity जो है वो inevitable हो जाती है capital accumulation के साथ, and therefore जब वो distance इतना बढ़ जाता है, he's looking at 1,000-year spans. जब बढ़ जाता है, then some means of conflict and violence brings back a new equilibrium. या जंग होती है, या वो बीमारी होती है, या शायद इस बार कोविड हो जाए, but something happens that brings that back. या revolution होती है. And he says that there are exceptions, जिस तरह यूरोप में था, यूरोप में, इंग्लैंड में था, और कुछ अमेरिका में था सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर के बाद, where societies themselves take policy measures to remedy this great inequity so that there is some imbalance. And the reason to remedy inequity in a very realist way is he's writing very much in a socialist Marxist tradition, but in a very realist argument, is कि उसके अगर वो आप नहीं करेंगे तो सोसाइटी में कॉन्फ्लिक्ट हो जाएगा. Right? And this you can see right here in your own society as in any other society. Nadeem sahab mentioned I've been visiting Pakistan after a long time. दोस्त मुझे कई बार खाने शाने पे ले जाते हैं, and I'm amazed to look at the prices on the menu. लेकिन जो मुझे खाने का शौक है वो छल्ली, जैसे भुट्टा कहते हैं, तो उसमें मैं रुका भुट्टा खाने के लिए, and I got the छल्ली, and that cost me 40 रुपए. तो मैंने बाबा जी से पूछा, आपकी सुबह जब आप आते हैं तो कितनी छल्ली होती है इसमें? जो बेचने के लिए आते, he said 50-60. 50-60 का मतलब क्या हुआ? 50-60 का मतलब हुआ 2000 इस वक्त, उसके बाद जहां जाके मैंने कॉफी और एक केक का पीस खाने उसकी कीमत, राइट? सो दैट्स व्हाट पिकेटी इज टॉकिंग अबाउट. ये नहीं कह रहा कि सही है गलत है, वो कह रहा है एक्यूमुलेशन ऑफ कैपिटल इधर बढ़ेगी, जब बढ़ेगी तो डिस्टेंस बढ़ेगा, बिकॉज दैट्स द पर्पस ऑफ कैपिटल. जब वो बढ़ेगा तो टेंशन बढ़ेगी और टेंशन की वजह से कॉन्फ्लिक्ट बढ़ेगी. आइदर यू मैनेज द कॉन्फ्लिक्ट थ्रू पॉलिसी और इट विल फाइंड सम वे टू मैनिफेस्ट इटसेल्फ, जिसके बाद वो ठीक हो जाएगा. वो फ्रांस में रेवोल्यूशन हो सकती है, वो रशिया में कम्युनिज्म हो सकता है, वो सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर हो सकती है, जिसके बाद सोसाइटी फाइंड्स ए न्यू इक्विलिब्रियम ऑफ रिलेटिव इक्विटी, and then the process starts again. And the purpose of policy, and this is why Piketty is Piketty, the purpose of policy, therefore, he says, कि अगर आप वो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट नहीं करवाना चाहते जो एक हिस्टोरिकल इनएविटेबिलिटी, then you use policy instruments so that छली और कॉफी के कप की कीमत जो है उसमें कोई इस किस्म का बैलेंस हो कि वो छली वाला बाबा जो है at some point he is going to lose it, as he should. Right? So that is the type of idea. So that's my idea one. By the way, ये जो इसकी है, the reason he says ideology in the second book, which is actually I think much more brilliant, which is unusual. I'm sorry, मैं इस पे Mariana पे आगे, let me go back to him. जो इसकी ये second book का जो second word उसने capital के साथ add किया, ideology, there he makes a much more bolder argument. He says it's not just the accumulation of capital. He says inequity is not a function of the economy only. It is a function of ideology, and it is a function of politics. I won't go into the detail, but the ideology part is कि he says जब capital accumulate होता है तो वो ideology create करता है, capital accumulation को support करती, and that cycle increases. The best, most interesting for us example he gives is of the caste system. इन हिस्टोरिकल इंडिया, जो हम अपने आप भी देखते हैं, उसको कहते हैं कुछ और है, लेकिन बेसिकली हम उसी सोसाइटी में अभी भी रहते हैं. बट दैट वेयर द आइडियोलॉजी फैसिलिटेट्स द एक्यूमुलेशन ऑफ इनइक्विटी, वो उसको लेजिटिमाइज करती है कि कुछ लोगों के पास वो एक्यूमुलेशन होना अच्छी बात है, राइट? या वो रिलीजन के थ्रू कर सकती है, या वो पॉलिटिक्स के थ्रू कर सकती है आइडियोलॉजी. Anyhow, without going too far, I should keep on the basics. My second person is also new. By the way, Piketty wasn't in my list last time, and I'll tell you, this person is new. There are a number of new people, and I don't know, Nadeem Sahib, whether you like them or not, but I think something is happening, especially in the world of economics. जो डिबेट्स मैं या नदीम साहब सुन के पले बड़े थे have become redundant, and you will see this in some of these authors. There is really something very sparkling, something very exciting happening, which is a new set of people are just refusing to sit into those boxes of left, right, Chicago, West Coast, East Coast. वो कह रहे हैं सारी गलत, and we are going to redefine without choosing sides. And one of them, I think particularly important, a name if you haven't heard, you should, and you should keep an eye on, is Mariana Mazzucato. She has a whole number of books. She's a very prolific author now, and she's a very prolific speaker. She's as much of a public intellectual now as a scholarly academic. But the book to really understand is her most sort of academic or even boring book, which is called The Entrepreneurial State. And the entrepreneurial state is this sort of idea of debumping public versus private sector myths. And she takes on, I don't think it's that interesting a book to read as the ideas there are. उसके बाद उसने 2-3 बुक्स नई लिखी हैं. एक उसने वो लिखा है मूनशॉट मिशन, द मिशन टू चेंज इकोनॉमिक्स. एंड दीस पीपल आर रियली सेइंग हम इकोनॉमिक्स की फील्ड ही चेंज कर रहे हैं, राइट? अब वो करें या ना करें, दैट अटेम्प्ट नीड्स टू बी एंगेज्ड. एंड व्हाट शी इज सेइंग इन द एंटरप्रेन्योरियल स्टेट इज कि ये जो स्टेट की हमने रोल इन इकोनॉमी की डिबेट को बाइफरकेट किया था इज मिसिंग द पॉइंट अकॉर्डिंग टू हर, व्हिच इज कि या स्टेट का ये काम है कि रास्ते से हट जाए, और मार्केट को वो खुला छोड़ दे और उसको मौका दे, उसको फैसिलिटेट करे, उसको ओपन करे, सो दैट द मार्केट कैन डू इट्स मैजिक। या ऑन द अदर साइड स्टेट का ये काम है कि जो वैक्यूम हो उसको वो फिल कर दे। पब्लिक ट्रांसपोर्ट मार्केट प्रोवाइड नहीं कर सकती तो स्टेट प्रोवाइड कर दे। हेल्थ जो है वो अगर स्टेट उस तरह नहीं प्रोवाइड कर सकती टू एवरीवन, देन द स्टेट स्टेप्स इन, राइट? सो इन सम वेज दैट सॉर्ट ऑफ बाइनरी आइडिया which led to the politics of either the minimal state or the maximal state. ये अमेरिका में खास तौर पर नजर आता है, आप ये दो आइडियोलॉजी बन जाती है कि गवर्नमेंट जो है आपने कितनी आपको गवर्नमेंट चाहिए, और हमारे जैसे मुल्क जो है वो स्ट्रैडल करते हैं. What she's saying is that the state's function is much more than that, and actually the state's actions have been much more than that, that the state is a primary entrepreneur in the economy. And she's using sort of very 21st century language, meaning entrepreneur, to say कि यार state वो experiments करती है और हमेशा करती है जो private sector वाला या individual कर नहीं सकता. And she takes the example of, for example, the creation of the internet, the going to the moon. In some ways, I don't know what she would say about the development of the vaccine for COVID, but I think she would use that also as an example. The vaccine might have been created by Moderna and Pfizer and Sinopharm and so on and so forth. But the entrepreneurial environment in which it could happen in 9 or 10 months across the world could not have been done except for the state. And what she's saying is that to think about the state ka function kya hai aapki economy mein, policy mein, we have to, according to her, get out of these boxes कि वो या regulator है, या वो provider of vacuum filler है, या वो opener of spaces. And she's saying that the state itself is an entrepreneur. And that, I think, is a very interesting idea. In fact, वो ये नहीं कहती कि entrepreneur हमेशा अच्छा है. हमारी society में भी, I would argue, if we can get into this in Q&A, the state has always been an entrepreneur. वो अच्छा हो या बुरा हो. वो कभी हमें बताती है अच्छा मुसलमान कौन होता है, कभी हमें बताती है अच्छा पाकिस्तानी कौन होता है, कभी वो अच्छे बताती है कि पेन कौन सा इस्तेमाल करना है, कभी वो बताती है यूनिवर्सिटी में क्या पढ़ना है. Right? But in multiple ways, what she is saying is think of the state as an entrepreneur and you start looking at the state differently. This is a very interesting one because Daniel Kahneman was in the list last time, but he is differently in this list this time. Last time, agar jo aap mein se kisi ko yaad ho, the book that I had put is the book that I think he's still most known for, and the book that is the most important, which is Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Daniel Kahneman is Nobel winner in economics. Some of the most interesting Nobel winners in economics have not been economists, and he's also not an economist. He's a psychologist. In many ways, he and a few other people, Thaler and others, changed the face of economics totally, I think. Again, ye Mazzucato वगैरह तो आप कोशिश कर रहे हैं, in the sense that what we now call behavioral economics, they took that to a whole new realm. And in some ways, this idea of rationality, जो मेरे ख्याल में अब कोई उस तरह नहीं believe करता है जिस तरह टेक्स्ट बुक पढ़ाती थी. अब तो टेक्स्ट बुक भी वैसे नहीं पढ़ाती, राइट? कि एक रैशनल एक्टर है वो हमेशा एक्टर. वो अगर था तो वो उसको मरे हुए बहुत अरसा हो चुका है. और उसको मारने वालों में सबसे important, I think, was Kahneman. Who was not saying people are not rational. He says that we are incapable of being rational. And हमारी कोशिश होनी चाहिए rational की, but rationality has bounds, and therefore our decisions are within those bounds. But last year, the book which I would still recommend, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, which is a masterpiece. But what Kahneman has done now is कि this year, जो पिछला साल गुजरा है, उसमें he came out with a new book written with Olivier, Sibony and Sunstein. Sunstein पे मुझे इसलिए दुख होता है क्योंकि if you remember last year मैंने एक किताब का नाम लिया था Nudge. उसका भी co-author वो था, लेकिन तब मैंने first author Thaler का नाम लिया था. So Sunstein is co-author on some very amazing things. But they come up with this book called Noise. And this is an amazing book. Usually Nobel लिखने के बाद, Nobel लेने के बाद, अमूमन लोग उतनी बड़ी किताब नहीं लिख सकते जितनी उन्होंने पहले लिखी होती. बड़े फिल्म एक्टरों की तरह है. एक जब बड़ी फिल्म हो जाए उसके बाद बाकी जो है ना वो उसी पे चलती. But to write Noise after Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, I think is quite an amazing achievement. And noise is about judgment. Judgment. वो bias की बात नहीं कर रहा. वो ये कह रहा है कि यार ये again rationality पे जा रहा है. This is why it's a policy argument. कि आप as an economist or as a policy maker, the thing you do all day is to make judgments. Nadeem साहब makes this judgment कि आदिल को बुलवाना है या नहीं बुलवाना. हमने ये in person करना है या hybrid करना है. Right? We make judgments all the time. And he's saying that there is a flaw in human judgment. We are not evolved enough to make the judgments without thinking that we think we can make without thinking. कि हम जो judgments gut feeling पे करते हैं, उसके बारे में हम उतना नहीं सोचते जितना हमें सोचना चाहिए. Thinking fast, thinking slow का भी मुद्दा ये था. But here he comes with this. ये उसका जो reading diagram is this one. कि एक तो बायस होती है. बायस है वो जो टॉप राइट पे जो आपको नजर आ रहा है. बायस ये है कि जब भी आप फैसला करते हैं आप एक तरफ लीन करते हैं, आप राइट लीन करते हैं, आप लेफ्ट लीन करते हैं, आप लिबरल लीन करते हैं, आप कंजर्वेटिव लीन करते हैं. वो बायस है, which means कि you consistently make the same type of leaning in a judgment. Noise is not that. Noise is कि एक आपने एडमिशन कमेटी बनाई, उसमें 3 बंदे रखे. Right? This is something that I as a academic administrator now deal with all the time. आपने 3 बंदे रखे एडमिशन कमेटी में या कोई प्राइस कमेटी ने, उनके पास वही तीनों के पास आई एप्लीकेशंस. 2 ने एक शख्स को टॉप किया, तीसरे ने कहा नहीं यार ये जिसको तुम हाईएस्ट मार्क्स दे रहे हो तो बिल्कुल ही बेवकूफ. Now that can be bias. But the interesting thing is कि एक ही बंदा जब बारी बारी different applications देखे और उनको differently gauge करे, then what is happening? And he is saying that as policy people, the world is full of noise. And the goal of the policy person is to reduce noise. ये जो तीसरा वाला है, the bottom left, in our own judgment. Now, I believe from what I know of PIDE, there are lots of people here, for example, who might be doing surveys of various parts. अगर आपने कभी भी survey fill किया या किसी से करवाया, you will ask a question and you will see कि the answer जो कर रहा है वो साथ वाले को देखता है कि यार तू क्या कह रहा है. And their answers will very often follow whatever other people in the group are doing. Right? So there are multiple, I mean, puri kitab hai on noise, but just the beauty of the idea that he's putting up is why, for me at least, Daniel Kahneman is on this list, but not with his previous book, but with this new one. So that is my third. My fourth के बारे में मैंने इसके बारे में बड़ा सोचा था कि ये जो है ना, ये वो आखिरी में जो नहीं होता है, एक आ जाता है एडमिशन में, चलो यार इसको रख ही. Not really. I mean, but I think in this year of COVID, if anyone comes into this list, it is Rutger Bregman. Rutger Bregman is this young, radical, angry, not angry, but radical, outside of every box you can think of, person from the Netherlands. He's a Dutch historian. और इसका कमाल ये है, and the reason I'm saying we should think about him, especially in the year of COVID, a lot of things that COVID has suddenly done, if anyone was talking about them before COVID, okay, this is what can happen, not about disease, lekin ye remote, work week, society, and so on and so forth. It was Rutger Bregman. Ye Dutch hai, Holland ka hai, young hai, historian hai, and he is amazingly optimistic. His most famous book, and the book I would recommend, is a book called Humankind. It's a very nice play on word, humankind as in mankind, womankind, but he's playing on the word kind. He is coming up and he calls it a hopeful history. And he comes up with a very fantastic idea. He says कि यार हम अच्छे लोग हैं. We are not as bad as we think we are. जितना बुरा हम बनने की कोशिश करते हैं, हम उतने बुरे हैं नहीं. और हम कोशिश भी करें तो बुरे नहीं हो सकते. Now, this is a fundamental attack on your profession if you are an economist. आपने तो पूरी की पूरी आर्गुमेंट इस बेसिस पे किया ना कि हर बंदा जो है वो सेल्फिश. वो वाली आर्गुमेंट निकाल दो तो ज्यादा नहीं बचता. Right? And what these people have, Mazzucato is doing the same. They are beginning to not question that argument, but to nuance that argument. And he's saying that we have created worlds in which, by assuming that someone is going to be unkind, we legitimize as well as enhance our own kindness. मैंने ये क्लासों में अपनी कई बार किया है. This also comes from Kahneman and Thaler. These experiments happen in lots of behavioral economics classes. If I do a survey in this room and I give each of you a paper and I say कि अगर आपको नीचे 100 रुपए गिरे हुए मिले, तो do you think you will look around कि किसके हैं और उसको दे दो? And generally the dominant answer would be कि yes, I would. Then if I give you another question, कि आज इस कमरे में जो बाकी लोग बैठे हुए, उनको अगर 100 रुपए गिरे हुए मिले, तो आपके ख्याल में वो ढूंढेंगे बंदा देने को या नहीं ढूंढेंगे? And the dominant answer is कि वो नहीं ढूंढेंगे, which means कि we all think कि यार बाकी सारे बुरे, मैं बड़ा अच्छा, लेकिन क्योंकि बाकी बुरे हैं, अब मैं भी बुरा हो जाता, right? And that argument, I'm making it very, very simple. But what Bregman is saying is that we've organized society around an unkindness, and he's saying that the hopeful history is that we are at a point of technology. He's an amazing optimist, where we now have the ability to unleash the better elements of humankind. And he has become recently the proponent of an idea, jiska mujhe bhi nahi pata I support or not, but it's an interesting idea. And more than that, it is interesting. It is taking so much space. I'm surprised how many people are now talking about it, which is the minimum wage. No, not the minimum wage, the basic wage. कि हर शख्स को एक सैलरी मिलनी चाहिए काम किए बगैर. There is a living, and now countries, including his own, नहीं ये हंसने वाली बात है. US में states हैं, 3 पिछले presidential candidates हैं. In a way, economically, it's a very simple proposition. It's basically a payback from government. Society is thriving. जिस तरह आप टैक्स लेते हैं, उस तरह एक मिनिमम अमाउंट जो है हर शख्स को बेसिक मिल जाए. And the math is very simple. वो already society करती है. This goes to Mazzucato. Society करती है ना कि आपको कुछ चीजें सेफ्टी नेट में दे देती है कि हेल्थ हर एक के पास है या पानी हर एक के पास है या बेसिक राइट्स. वो कहते हैं वो करने के बजाय जो है ना बेसिक एक अमाउंट जो है, एंड देन द पर्सन कैन चूज उसके बाद मैंने काम करना है कि नहीं करना, और जो करेगा वो अपना उसको इनहांस कर सकता है, लेकिन बेसिक बजाय जीरो होने के is some level. It is amazing how much traction this is taking. When he started talking about the idea कि ये 5-day के week का क्या math है? Why is 5-day week so important? 4 क्यों नहीं हो सकता? 3 क्यों नहीं हो सकता? लोग घर पे काम क्यों नहीं कर सकते? Right? That's why I'm putting him up there, because suddenly what he and others have started talking about is that we've made some assumptions that have come from reality at an earlier time, which technology, AI की वो बात करता है, वो IT की बात करता है, mostly वो health की और medicine की बात करता है, has now created the question of distribution in societies to be a different question. Let me just keep on going because I don't want to spend too time. Rachel Carson is someone who was there before and I think should remain there. I am always, she's actually also the oldest in terms of ye kab likhi gayi thi. But Rachel Carson is a powerhouse. Rachel Carson was a chemist. Rachel Carson ne kitab likhi Silent Spring. Silent Spring, she was a chemist. She was a chemist, and the Silent Spring was chemicals in the environment were killing the spring. जो क्या होता है, झरना कहते नहीं, spring क्या होती है? चश्मा near where she lived, right? And the reason I put her out there is that the tasveer hai, this is testifying to Congress. That one book and this one person essentially created what you call the modern environmental movement, but more than that, the modern environmental regulatory movement. And more than that, the idea of science as a policy information basis. Ke science ka basis kya, right? And the reason I want to keep her in this list, even though I had it last time, is that COVID has again proven that as a policy challenge. COVID का policy challenge ये नहीं था कि COVID की vaccine कहाँ से आएगी, और अभी भी नहीं. COVID का challenge eventually बना नहीं. Challenge उसका जो था वो ये बना कि science पे how people are going to react to the science, जिसको आप anti-vaxxers कहते हैं. You see this in a lot of Western societies, but even in our own societies. And a whole host of questions came कि this assumption कि जी science हमें बता देगी और हम उसको follow कर लेंगे becomes questionable as it had there. I'm pushing forth because I want to open up for question. Another new person on my list, and this is again one of those exciting new people, keep the name alive because ye naam aap bahut sunenge. Whether you like it or not, is this young person, British, called Kate Raworth. Kate Raworth, like Mariana before, is again a powerhouse, very powerful speaker, very, very, very articulate. And more than that, she is, ये जो आप लोग भी आजकल यूज कर रहे हैं, PIDE में मैं देखता हूँ, she is one of those people who, क्योंकि ये young है, नई generation की है, she has used graphics and the idea of explaining things in pictures as an academic to a new level. Academic कतराते हैं ना, हमारा ग्राफ भी बड़ा boring सा होता है. And her most famous book, on which now even countries are changing their policy. She has now left the university and she's in the Netherlands, which is trying to change their national economic policy around this book of hers called the Doughnut Economics. And the Doughnut Economics is again questioning, she questions Paul Samuelson. कहती है वो Paul Samuelson का कमाल ये था कि उसने टेक्स्ट बुक लिखी थी. जब उसने टेक्स्ट बुक लिख दी तो पूरी दुनिया ने वही टेक्स्ट बुक पढ़ाई. वो जब बहुत आउटडेटेड भी हो गई तो हम वही पढ़ते रहे. जिस तरह आप कह रहे थे कि नोट्स वही, वो अमेरिका में भी यही होता है. And she says कि we need a new textbook or new ways, and that's her 7 ways of thinking like a 21st century economics. And the donut is वो जो तस्वीर के पीछे उसकी स्लाइड नजर आ रही. This very simple idea, again book is much more complex, but the idea is very simple. कि हम growth paradigm में we were only looking at the growth, and then the fight became because के the limits to growth कि growth की क्या problem हो रही थी. And the development wallahs were feeling left out because there are problems of not enough growth. And that's the donut. कि there is a problem in the whole when there is not enough. And there is a problem outside the donut when you exceed a limit. चाहे वो pollution की हो, चाहे वो लाहौर की smog की हो, चाहे वो कराची की heat की हो, and so on and so forth. Right? And in using that and other ideas, there are 7 sort of major things there. But that's what Kate Raworth does, and I think does very brilliantly. That's the idea I would put. The next name, this is also new to the list, is Francis Fukuyama. Now, Francis Fukuyama, लोगों को पता है, किसी को पता है? नाम सुना है? हाँ, अच्छा, अभी तक फ्रांसिस फुकुयामा को लोग याद करते हैं वो लास्ट मैन विच इज एंड ऑफ हिस्ट्री. उसका टाइटल इतना कमाल था कि सारे उस पे हा हा करके हंसते थे, इसलिए जो है वो याद रह जाता था. इट एक्चुअली इज अ ब्रिलियंट बुक एंड ही वाज प्रूव्ड रॉन्ग, लेकिन पार्टली नॉट. अगर वो आप किताब पढ़ें तो ही इज नॉट रियली सेइंग व्हाट द टाइटल सजेस्ट्स. But Francis Fukuyama is again one of the great he's a political economist, he's a political scientist, but also sort of big picture thinking, especially on a post-COVID world, he's become a major person. There's a new book on that, but that's not the book I wanted to put. This I really wanted to put. Last time I thought कि मैंने क्यों नहीं डाला. The book I want to put is the one that is not talked about. It is called Trust. It is a very मुश्किल बुक है. फजूल में मुश्किल बना रहा है बिकॉज इट्स वेरी वेल रिसर्च, बड़ी थ्योरेटिकल करके उसने इतना डाला कि आपका सब जब तक दर्द ना करे समझ नहीं आता, लेकिन जब समझ आ जाए तो फिर वाह वाह. एंड स्पेशली फॉर पाकिस्तान व्हाट ही टॉक्स अबाउट आई थिंक इज एग्जैक्टली राइट. ही सेज कि यार सोसाइटी में ट्रस्ट इज अ रिसोर्स. जिस तरह कंट्रीज आर डिफाइंड कि इसके पास तेल है, इसके पास नहीं है, इसके पास आईटी है, इसके पास नहीं है, इसके पास मैन्युफैक्चरिंग है, इसके पास सर्विसेज है. He says trust is a resource like that, right? And a lot of it is about society and governance and politics, but a lot of it is about policy and economics. He says कि trust को as an economic resource समझो. मुझे ट्रस्ट नहीं है बाकी ड्राइवरों पे, सड़क पे और अपनी ड्राइविंग पे, इसलिए मैं एक ड्राइवर रख लेता हूं. उसकी एक कॉस्ट होती है. जब सोसाइटी में ट्रस्ट नहीं होता, कॉस्ट चेंज होती है. मुझे ट्रस्ट नहीं है कि पुलिस जो है वो डाकों से मुझे बचा सकती. सो या मैं कुत्ता रख लेता हूं या मैं गार्ड रख लेता हूं, उसकी एक कॉस्ट होती है, राइट? मुझे ट्रस्ट नहीं है कि जिस स्कूल में मैं अपने बच्चे को भेज रहा हूं वो उसको अच्छी एजुकेशन दे रहा है, इसलिए शाम को मैं एक ट्यूशन रख लेता हूं. राइट? मुझे ट्रस्ट नहीं है कि मेरा नेबर जो है वो मेरा इंटरेस्ट करेगा, इसलिए मैं सीमेंट की दीवार बना देता हूं। आई लिव इन द यूएस, मेरा किसी साइड पे नेबर के साथ कोई दीवार नहीं। मुझे नहीं पता मेरी जमीन कहां खत्म होती है, उनकी कहां खत्म होती है, उनको भी नहीं पता, लेकिन उन्हें भी ट्रस्ट है, मुझे भी ट्रस्ट है कि वो 4 इंच जो है इधर से उधर नहीं होगा। राइट? उसकी बेनिफिट क्या हुआ? इकोनॉमिक बेनिफिट क्या हुआ कि ना मुझे दीवार बनानी पड़ी, ना मुझे गार्ड रखना पड़ा। राइट? सो व्हाट ही इज सेइंग इज कि यार ट्रस्ट, आई हैव ऑलवेज थॉट कि अगर मैं कभी पाकिस्तान पे किताब लिखूं, इट वुड बी ऑन सोसाइटल ट्रस्ट एंड द कॉस्ट ऑफ डिसट्रस्ट। अगर सिर्फ एक चीज को चेंज हो सके ना इस मुल्क में, विच इज कि आपका मेरा एक दूसरे पे ट्रस्ट जो है, वो ऐसे नहीं होगा, मेरे कहने से नहीं चेंज होगा, मेरी हरकतों से होगा, आपकी हरकतों से होगा। द इकोनॉमिक वैल्यू ऑफ दैट, आई थिंक हम अपना डेट पे कर सकते हैं। मैं बोंगियां मार रहा हूं, लेकिन इट विल बी वेरी वेरी हाई। Right? And that is the brilliance of the idea of Fukuyama, to think of trust as an economic value, not just as a moral value, right? And that is why he's here. Now, ye hai hamara superstar. I don't know if people know who this person is. This is the world's most popular, certainly, professor. And he's a philosopher. Sakrat Mareni. This is Michael Sandel. Michael Sandel is a professor of philosophy at Harvard. अगर आपने YouTube पे बाकी वीडियो वाली जब देख लें वीडियो, उसके बाद इसकी जाके देखें, इसका जो क्लास का लेक्चर है उस पे 2 मिलियन 1 मिलियन व्यू होते हैं। And he teaches the world's most famous course, which is a course on justice. कम से कम पहला लेक्चर जरूर सुन लीजिएगा। His most famous book is on justice. ये कितना बड़ा हीरो है, या हम तो 20-40 बंदों को बोलते हैं ना, ये इतना बड़ा हीरो है कि ये जब बोलता है तो स्टेडियम में बोलता है। दैट इज समथिंग अबाउट सुनने वालों पे भी, कि जब आपने लाइक आदमी को सुनना है तो पीपल कम एंड लिसन टू देम लाइक पीपल लिसन टू कॉन्सर्ट्स, राइट? दैट्स माइकल सैंडेल. Michael Sandel's great book, the book he's known for, he's a philosopher, is Justice. I think every economist should read that book, but that's not the book that I want to present today. The book I want to present today is also written for Pakistan. It is his new book. It is not his best book, but the idea, मैंने पिछले कम से कम 3-4 साल में कोई ऐसी किताब नहीं पढ़ी which blew me away as much as this. Blew me away का मतलब ये नहीं कि वो अच्छी है बुरी है, मुझे अभी तक नहीं पता what I agree with and what I don't. But what I do know is कि I was being hit by ideas जो या मैंने सोचे नहीं थे और या मैं अपने आप को कहता था यार ये मैंने क्यों नहीं सोचे. Right? And that book is this thing called The Tyranny of Merit. He's a Harvard professor and basically he starts with the Harvard idea कि यार ये जो merit है ना ये ढकोसला नहीं, ढकोसला नहीं कहते, ये dangerous idea. ये एक जब taken to its extreme can become a dangerous idea because merit begets elite and merit begets sort of cliques and आपकी एक बार वो लॉटरी लग जाए तो फिर वो सारी जिंदगी की चलती है and it has, I'm not doing justice to his argument, but again this is a serious philosopher who's saying कि ये merit वाला idea ना इसको हमें थोड़ा सा सोचना चाहिए. Now this is a very very revolutionary idea क्योंकि merit ही हम कहते हैं ना, merit नहीं है तो फिर क्या. लेकिन the reason I say it's a Pakistani idea, it's an idea that Pakistanis should forward. I do think in this country also हम कई बार merit को जो है ना बड़ा misuse करते हैं. For example, merit का मतलब होता है senior को job दे दो. हालांकि मेरे ख्याल में तो merit का मतलब है ही उल्टा. अगर सबसे लायक आप हैं और आप senior नहीं है तो merit का मतलब ये है कि आपको हम दिए जाए job. ये क्या बात है कि जल्दी बारी आई वो दे दो. That may be fair, that may be the rule, but that's certainly not merit. Merit is that when someone is deserving on performance, then the rule should be broken for that person. They should be rewarded for that. But what he's talking about is that merit makes tyranny. And merit creates inequities in society. आखिरी में इसमें बात करूंगा because I'm running out of time. इसका एक final chapter में वो कहता है कि हार्वर्ड की एडमिशन जो है ना वो ऐसे होनी चाहिए क्योंकि यार लम्स की या व्हाटएवर की, क्योंकि वो एक तरह से लॉटरी लग जाती है कि बेसिक एक क्राइटेरिया रख दो और उसके बाद सारी एप्लीकेशनों को हवा में फेंक दो, जो लेफ्ट साइड पे गिरती है उन सारों को अंदर रख लो. बिकॉज दे विल एज लॉन्ग एज बेसिक मेरिट मीट कर रहे हैं, दे विल कम आउट लुकिंग एज गुड. right? But what he's saying is about choice in society and about justice in society, again, because this is a very, very serious person. I'm running out of time, so I will run. I'm not going to spend too much time on one of my favorite people, Elinor Ostrom. Elinor Ostrom, हमने पिछली बार भी बात की थी. Elinor Ostrom was the first woman to get the Nobel for economics, and again, she wasn't an economist, but it was one of those mind-shaking Nobels. Essentially, इसकी ये जो किताब थी, Evolution, Governing the Commons, which questioned this idea of the tragedy of the commons. Or again, very important for policy people in Pakistan, because it kind of says कि यार पहले देख तो लो कि कौन से governance systems होते हैं जो which actually work. जब आपकी नानी कमेटी डालती है तो उसका mechanism क्या होता है? What's the economic rationale and mechanism of that? Right? And that is the type of work that she came with, so I will keep that. The other one that I've kept, and this it took a lot of time, मैं सोचता रहा पहले मैंने slide बनाई फिर मैंने उसको cancel कर दिया, was Angus Deaton. Angus Deaton is also a Nobel winner. And the book I've kept is the one I kept last time, which is The Great Escape. Now, this year, he has a new book with his wife, Anne Case, which is called Death of Despair, which is also a very good book, which is essentially about the idea that America is the only country in the developed country where life expectancy is going down. And that's what he calls Death of Despair, and he tries to understand कि वो क्या हो. But I think his great book is still The Great Escape. उसमें एक तो वो क्वेश्चन करता है effectiveness of aid. कहता है aid से कभी कोई ऊपर नहीं. दूसरा वो कहता है यार ज़्यादातर तो ऊपर गए हैं वैसे. And he says the great story of development is that societies have escaped poverty. Now, some have escaped it more, some have escaped it less. But what he's trying to prove is it's just not about positive or negative. He's trying to see कि ये कैसे होता है great escape. And that's where he comes. It is not simply कि आपको जिस पे आप aid pump कर दी. In fact, he says it has lots of negatives and so on and so forth. But what are the type of institutions? What are the type of processes that allow the great escape? Right? And that book, I think, is still sort of, despite him being a Nobel winner, underappreciated. I also chose to keep Amartya Sen's book because everyone seems to know about him, but I find very often that people don't actually read him, and I wish they did. Because I think his development as freedom is underappreciated. This idea that development hoti kya? And therefore I have kept it. I won't talk about it because I did talk about it at length last time. Let me bring this to my last one, which is also kept from last time, which is Dr. Mahbub. And I've kept it again because I think the ideas matter. And I think Dr. Saab, again, we all kind of know him, but I wish we also read him. Unki, in some ways, his getting into politics and governance overshadowed his academic brilliance. And we all think कि यार ये तो अपने वो घर की मुर्गी की तरह हमें पढ़ने की जरूरत नहीं, हमें पता है क्या क्या. But हमें नहीं पता. And he truly is one of those. My एतराज with him is that by coming into politics, I think he was not able to do as much academically that he should have if you read his early work. But the one that I am pointing out here is human development. Right? Not the human development report, but the idea of human development, which to me as a development person is still one of the most brilliant ways to understand it. Again, very, very briefly, human development was this idea that sort of GDP nahi hai, it's health plus wealth plus knowledge. Right? And it wasn't just his, it was Amartya Sen, it was Meghnad Desai. He had finished his tenure here, uske baad he went to the UN, and there unko UN ne kaha, yaar kuch karo, jo marzi karna hai karo. And he created this idea of human development. He created the index, and he created the report, which is now 25 years on. And the idea is such a strong one that it has got. But the health, wealth, knowledge wala jo idea as development is truly brilliant. The way I explain it, at least to my students, kam se kam ek Punjabi ka jumla unko samajh aata hai ki essentially development, as I understand it, I mean the words are mine, but the ideas are his, is the answer that someone gives to the question, kya haal hai? When you ask someone, kya haal hai? The answer to that is what development is. Now you can try it after this. आप जाके अपने पापा से, ताई से, दोस्त से, बाजी से, भाई से पूछ लें कि क्या हाल है. They are not going to tell you कि जी आज stock exchange क्या थी. They are not going to tell you कि Gini coefficient क्या है. They are not even probably going to tell you dollar, maybe dollar क्योंकि इतना गिर रहा है शायद क्या है. They're going to tell you, yaar, मेरी बेटी पास हो गई, मेरे भाई को जॉब मिलती, मैंने बड़ी अच्छा ड्रामा देखा, मेरी कमर रह गई. Just try to catalog it, and it will fall into those three categories. People will talk about health, people will talk about wealth, people will talk about knowledge, right? And that was the brilliance and idea of Dr. Mahbub. To give you just one, this is the last of the books. Iske baad 2 slides and then I finish. But to give you an idea, Human Development Index ab jo hai, kafi usko matlab 25 se zyada saal ho gaye. This is how Pakistan has fared on it, right? So human development एक तरह से weight की तरह ऊपर जानी चाहिए, but if you see that graph, वो वहाँ unfortunately आ रहा है, वो आखिर में टुंडा नीचे जा रहा है, right? It's going down, which it shouldn't. We are 152nd in the world. We were at 0.404 in 1990, 562 in 17. So हम ऊपर गए, फिर थोड़ा सा नीचे आए हैं to 560 in 19. लेकिन for Pakistanis to understand हमारी development, how it is going, the only question you need to ask is how is India doing, right? So let us compare the same thing to India. That is the human development of India, and you see again कि वो जो आपका wedge है वो बढ़ रहा है. That's not a surprise. That's not a surprise. ये हमें पता है. The more interesting one is this. That's Sri Lanka, right? A country that has as much terrorism as Pakistan, probably more. And the magic of Dr. Mahbub and human development, why is Sri Lanka up there when Pakistan and even India is down there? Anyone? Jawab kya? One word. Education, essentially, right? You have 90% literacy, they export teachers. Pakistan is Sri Lankan teacher, right? And that starts showing up. The more interesting one is Afghanistan. Now, this is 1990. We don't know how it will go. It was already going down, but essentially it was one of the things you are seeing in Kabul might be this graph, which is the investment that was pumped in schooling in the cities, right? But here is where it becomes even more interesting. That's Iran. Iran kyun hai itna upar? More science, partly yes, but human development again was key definition. They can health, wealth development. Education, yes, but education what? Female education at the higher education level. Iran has some of the highest profile of university participation and quality, not only in the region, but across the Muslim world, and actually not only in the Muslim world, but across the region, right? So again, what you start seeing is that you start seeing it. Now, ye wali kahani, jab main 10 saal pehle sunata tha, to people wouldn't, now everyone knows about it. That's Bangladesh, and you see sort of where it takes over. You again go back to the Mahbub formula, and you see where the shift happens. And the shift happens essentially. This is the Grameen factor, if you will, women in the workplace, right? Which is a revolution we're also seeing here. Women in the workplace ki profile bahut change hogi. Now again, that's a separate question. You get Nepal, and you see them taking off ahead of Pakistan too, right? So the point I'm saying is कि idea जब पक जाता है तो उसकी बड़ी value होती है. That was my list. I'm sorry for having gone too long, but allow me this last slide before I end. So the formula there, 10 minus 5 plus 7. मैंने पिछली बार 10 किए थे, उनमें से 5 मैंने निकाल दिए और 7 मैंने ऐड कर दिए, so that 10 के बजाय इस बार 12 थे. But let me leave you with the ones I took off, so that you at least remember, if you do want to, if you do have the time to read these things. Richard Thaler, बड़ा दुख हुआ था मुझे नाज निकाल के, because it's such a pleasant book to read, and so rich with policy ideas of things that can actually lead to action, where theory actually can turn into action so beautifully. So Richard Thaler is one. Daniel Kahneman ka nahi hua tha, because we replaced his thinking fast, thinking slow with noise. Tom Schelling was my teacher, Nobel in economics, and we took this out. He's talking more about conflict, but I hope you do look. Nassim Taleb, I took out. I think he's brilliant, but he's very difficult to read, and he can come across as arrogant, as my students keep telling me. And finally, the one I took out was Why Nations Fail. Still a good book, much better than the new one that they wrote on the corridor, but important book. So let me leave there. I don't have a thesis here beyond what the one I started with, which is that ideas matter. I do not know कि जो मैंने 12 idea दिए हैं, these are the best ideas. I don't think they are. You can make your own list. You can bring up your own ideas. But what I do know is that ideas matter. And not knowing what ideas you are working on is truly a scary thought. And that is why these books are important or other books are important. I hope this is of some interest. Thank you very much.